Finding the time to be here for tonight's session. I know you probably had to forgo dinner in order to be here, so thank you very much. So my name is Daniela Massiceti. I'm a PhD student, and joining me this evening to present is George Konidaris, who's a professor at Brown University. And a very big part of this session, who was not able to be here today, is Laura Sevilla from University of Edinburgh. So the title of tonight's session is How to Write a Great Research Paper. So I am a current PhD student. Laura is a just starting faculty at the University of Edinburgh, and then George is an established professor. So hopefully across these three stages you'll get a good sense of, well, what is a research proposal, why is it useful, how to write a good one, and hopefully you can find something valuable in that. So, yeah, George and I are going to split up the presentation in bits and pieces, so we'll see how that goes. So the first thing that I want to say is, okay, so to get a sense of the room, how many of you are undergrad or honors students? Okay, cool. Master students? Cool. PhD students? Cool, and then other, I guess the rest. All right. Okay, and so how many of you are actively looking or considering applying for a PhD in the near future? Okay, so hopefully this session will be useful. Good stuff. So yeah, here we have a Google form. So if you are currently planning on applying for a PhD program, please enter your details there. And basically we just want to, well, ideally we want to be able to pair you up with a mentor who can help you through that application process. We can't make any promises, but ultimately if we capture your details here, then we are more likely to make a pairing. So yeah, this link there, and it'll be in the footer of all the slides going forwards. Okay, so we'll start off by thinking about, okay, well, what even is a research proposal? So most of the time they're used in PhD applications. They're kind of the fundamental core of a PhD application. And it's essentially a description of the work that you want to do in your PhD. So this is 3 to 5 years, depending on where you're doing it, and essentially your motivation for wanting to do this particular research. And in general, it needs to address something new that has not been done before, and something better. So some improvement in accuracy or efficiency on the current state of the art. And the important things to note is that when a supervisor gets when your prospective supervisor gets this PhD proposal, this application, they're looking for a couple of things. They're looking obviously at the content, what you've written, but they're also looking for passion, they're looking for innovation, they're looking for some other core things which may demonstrate that you would be a good PhD student, someone who can endure 3 to 5 years of potentially some downs and ups. So I'm at the end of my PhD, and I can tell you that it's not all up. There are some curves. And essentially, just looking to see that potential, that good research potential. And another important thing to note is that the research proposal is not a fixed in stone thing. So your research proposal is essentially a pitch of what you're proposing to do, but that pitch can change as your peer, and in fact mine did. So I started off with a proposal, and by the time that I've now reached the end of my PhD, I mean, in broad strokes, I've kind of stayed within the bounds of what I said I'd do, but the route that I took on how to approach that research question changed. And so I think that's important to remember about a research proposal. So an example here of how you could think about framing a research proposal. Problem P is important because of A1 and A2 applications or reasons. I'm passionate about it because of F factors. So far, people have come up with S1 and S2 solutions. However, they are slow or inaccurate or not applicable sometimes. I propose instead, so this is now the solution, this is what I'm going to do in my PhD. I propose instead to solve a problem with S3. The reason it has not been done before is because of XYZ, but we can get around it by doing these other things. And the exact way I would start the project is by doing experiment E and collecting data D. So you sort of are having this, okay, what is my broad motivation? Why am I doing this? Then okay, well, what is my way? What am I proposing on how I'm going to tackle this problem? And then finally wrapping up with some concrete steps about what would be your approach, what would be your steps to tackle that problem. Now, in this talk, we're primarily going to be focusing on PhD applications, but they're useful in actually a number of different contexts. So hopefully the people in the audience here who are PhD students and higher up, you'll see that these research proposals, or hopefully what we'll discuss in today's session, will be useful for you to take away in terms of writing grants. So this is when you're going to a company or a government institution and saying, this is what I'm proposing to do, and please give me money to do it. And also fellowships and scholarships. So when you're applying for funding, for example, to fund your PhD program or master's program, they may often also ask for, well, what are you going to do in your program? And so something like a research proposal would be an ideal thing to submit to them. So in other words, yeah, research proposals show up very often. So yeah, hand over to George.
All right. Thanks, Daniela. So one quick note is that Daniela and Laura are mostly responsible for the content. They did all the work. I'm here in part to substitute for Laura. I'm like a less charming version of her, but I'm going to do my best. Okay. So one thing that I should note, just coming up in advance, that I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between American and British PhD programs. When we were talking about American-only things, there'll be a little flag, so you'll know what's happening. Okay, so Laura and Daniela, which is a very, very smart thing to do, actually polled a bunch of their friends who are faculty and asked them how important the research statement component of the PhD application was. And almost everyone said that it was the first most important or the second most important part of the application. Okay, so the people who said it was the second most important said after grades or publications. Okay, so I can tell you that grades are never sufficient. They're occasionally sufficient for rejecting an application, but they're not sufficient for accepting an application. You can't A your way into a PhD. So what grades or publications mean is mostly publications, or something like that if you have them. Most students don't, but if you do have them, that's a nice thing. Okay, so 70% of people think it's the first or the second most important thing. So let's talk about what a PhD is a little bit and how it differs between the places that you would be looking to apply. So I did my undergraduate in South Africa. What a PhD was for us, okay, Africa's a big place, so we're generalizing wildly here, is a 3-year thesis-only degree that you do after a master's, typically. Okay, but in the US system, you don't necessarily have to go in with a master's, and it's a longer degree. It's 5 to 6 years, and you will spend the first 2 years doing coursework, typically. As well as research, you do research at the same time, but you spend 2 years doing what they call breadth and depth courses. So you have to prove that you're at the graduate level in all areas of computer science, and then you have to take depth courses in your specific area that prepare you for research. And because it's longer, the requirements to finish are sometimes a little heavier, so usually with the US PhD, you expect to come out with at least 3 strong first author publications. In the UK, Germany, Sweden, and the rest of Europe, PhD is 3 to 4 years, and the coursework is either absent or optional. Okay. So you could come in with a master's, but you don't necessarily have to. And because it's a little shorter, 3 papers is really nice, but it's not always the case. So one way to think about these two things is the difference is in the first couple of years, and then that is reflected a little bit in the difference in what the application looks like. So one other thing that I should mention that I forgot to put on the slides is that in the US, it is typically the case that the university that you apply to funds you. Okay, so the person whose attention you most want out of life is the head of the admissions committee at the American university. For a lot of European and British PhDs, you get your own funding through a separate foundation, like you get a Commonwealth scholarship or something like that. You can get it through the university, but it's almost a separate process. Okay, so, and for almost all of those applications, you'll have to write a research statement, or a research proposal, both for the PhD application and for the funding opportunity. Okay, so why to do a PhD in CS now? Okay, so before we get to the bullet points, I'm going to say one thing, which is the most important thing, is are you a researcher? Okay, so by the time you've done some research, you know that you're a researcher or not. Okay, if you're a researcher, you should do a PhD. PhDs are for researchers. And you know you're a researcher because it's like who you are. It's not like a thing that you do or an optional choice. It's just like what you turned out to be. That's the person you are, you're a researcher, and there's kind of no way around it. Okay. How do you know? Because you can feel it, like the first time you do it, you know. So it helps to have done some research, right? It's hard to know before you've done your first piece of research. But after you've done your first or even your second piece of research, even if it was just a small project at the undergrad level, you kind of feel that, like, yeah, I'm not the kind of person who spends a lot of time being a software engineer in a company and builds nice pieces of software that got packaged in the world. I'm the kind of person who someone gives me a problem that no one else has ever solved, and I take a piece out of it. And it's exciting and fun and cool, and the uncertainty is part of the excitement. Okay. Other reasons to do it. Interesting and exciting work. You could go and work at a lot of places. The coolest possible job in the universe is to be a university professor, in my opinion. And university professors do a lot of things. They do research. This is mostly what they do. They teach. This is mostly what students think they do. And they mentor, which is actually, I guess that's probably most of what. We spend a lot of time talking to people and getting them through research experiences. You can be a research scientist at, like one of those tiny small companies like Google DeepMind that, you may not have heard of, but turns out to be a thing. And at those companies, what you do mostly is you produce research. Occasionally, that research is commercially oriented. Okay, so companies, unlike universities, live in capitalism, and that means that eventually what you do has to make some money. Maybe, some companies are almost infinitely rich and they can pretend not to be capitalism, but most of them eventually are. Okay. And then there's the sort of research engineering role, which is more about building the infrastructure that makes this stuff happen. Okay, so develop the engineering infrastructure needed to make research happen. Some PhD students at the end of the PhD was like, that was the funnest thing. Right? That was the coolest thing to like. There's this new piece of technology or some new ideas, and they're kind of starting to come together through some research papers, and I would just love to read those research papers and write a piece of code that just does everything, and it's perfect and wonderful, and I'm the first person to make it happen. But it's mostly implementation. That's kind of what a research engineering role looks like. There's some flexibility that comes with being a researcher. It's very easy to move countries if you're a researcher because there's not many of them with that level of qualification. You get to choose, in many cases, what kind of creative work you want to do, and you can care a little bit about the field that you want to spend your time in, and you can make substantial money. Here I should point out that if making money in life is your goal, there are easier and shorter ways to do it. There are ways that do not involve like sitting in a room for 5 years, racking your brains and solving a new piece of technology, but generally speaking, the life is pretty comfortable. I should say that if you were to rank these things and how well they get paid, depending on the company, this is probably the highest paid, and then this is probably the second highest paid, and this is probably the third highest paid. Not that I'm bitter or anything, but generally speaking, people are pretty happy with that sort of stuff. Okay, so what's in a PhD application? Now here there is a crucial difference. Okay, so almost everything is the same, but in the US you write something called a statement of purpose, and I'll just talk for 1 or 2 slides about that. And in the UK you write something called a research proposal. UK and the rest of Europe. You have to submit a resume or a CV. You have to submit transcripts of your grades, authenticated transcripts from your university. Sometimes, depending on the university you went to and the bureaucracy, these may take some time to get. And you may have to make friends with various administrators, so you should know that in advance. And then you have to get some letters of recommendation from people who've worked for you. So when I'm evaluating a PhD application, these things are super, super important, letters of recommendation. So we'll talk about what they should say in a moment. Then you write a personal statement. Actually, these things are the same in the States. You have to take a language test if you come from a university where English is not the first language. I guess it must be different in Germany. Maybe you have to take a German test, but I've not applied for German schools. And then you have to write a GRE, which is a weird sort of IQ testy thing that they do to people to see that they can do enough math to succeed at grad school. And like things like IQ tests, it's now gamed. So it is the case that to get into a good PhD program in the States doing machine learning, you want to be in the 90th or higher percentile for the quantitative part, that's the math part, for the GRE. That means you need to be better than 9 out of 10 of the people who write that exam. That sounds scary, but it isn't. Don't forget that more than half the people who write that exam are writing it for entrance to like an English literature department or something like that, okay? So it's not that you have to beat 9 out of 10 computer scientists, it's that you have to beat 9 out of 10 people who are doing a PhD. Okay. Even then, you should practice. You should practice a lot, because this is the kind of test that one can drill, and the only way to get top grades in it is to drill. And it sucks, but it's just life. Okay, so let's talk about a couple of these things. So we're going to talk for most of this talk about the research proposal, because in my opinion it's harder. And I'll talk a little bit about what a statement of purpose looks like next. For the transcripts, they may ask for translated versions. So I remember at WITS when I did an undergrad, they didn't need to translate it, but it came with an explanation of grades for international universities that said this is about how many students get an A or a first, this is how many get a second, and it just helps them calibrate, right? Because one of the things you discover when you go overseas is that everything is different for every university, and it's helpful if those transcripts come with stuff that explains stuff. These letters of recommendation, sorry, for the resume, yes, okay. In America, we call this a CV. This is not, so leave off your picture and stuff like that. What you want is you want something that's about 2 pages and lists your professional accomplishments and degrees, what you studied, relevant coursework, that sort of stuff. Any awards you get, any prizes should be there as well. Okay. So that's pretty standard. What you do is you put the most important stuff first, so you say education, then you say things like awards, and then you say things like publications. Okay, so the letters of recommendation. So I can tell you that at Brown, we only very occasionally get PhD applicants from African universities, and unfortunately in many of those cases, the letters of recommendation look like a character reference. They will say that this person is very trustworthy, and they show up on time, and they're a very nice person, and everyone loves them. Okay, but that's not actually what this is trying to achieve. So the way to think about, at least the way that I think about a PhD applicant, is I get this like little tiny folder of paper, and I have to evaluate this whole person, and I have to estimate the probability with which they can do successful research. Okay, so some of that information is in your resume, like, where did you get your degrees and what subjects did you take? And some of it's in your transcript that says, like, what grades did you get? But that's not the part that is interesting for the letters. What's interesting for the letters is concrete examples of stuff that you did that explain why you would be good at research. Okay, so your letter writers should focus on your ability to do deep technical work, your ability to be creative and stubborn, and all these sorts of things. Okay, they need to tell from their perspective why they think you would be a good researcher. Okay, so if you ask someone for a letter of recommendation, you should explain that that is what they want. Then you should send them a copy of a CV, and I ask my students to write something called a brag sheet. This is terribly un-African, but I live in America now, so we have to think about things differently. I ask the students to give me a bulleted list of the coolest things that they've done, especially the things that they've done with me, to remind me of all the cool stuff. Okay, so you wrote this piece of software in the course that you took with me 2 years ago, and it was highest graded in the course, and it had this cool idea in it. There is no way that I would remember that, but it's great material for a letter of reference. Okay, so if you hand that in when you submit those things, and you help the people writing your letters of reference understand what to talk about, that really helps them a lot. Okay. This language test is the thing that hopefully you can avoid, and the GRE, these are things you just have to practice, and you have to schedule. There are not things that you can do like tomorrow. You can't walk in and take one. You have to book it a few weeks in advance. They are way unreasonably expensive, so you should know about that a little bit in advance and plan. Okay, so this is the little American thing here, which says this is an American PhD program only thing. In American PhD programs, you don't submit a research proposal. You don't decide what you're going to do in your PhD or propose early. What you do is submit something called a statement of purpose. And that sounds like an extraordinarily vague thing, and that's partly by design. So the statement of purpose is your opportunity to tell me about all the things, all the reasons why you would be a good researcher. Okay, that's what it's about. And it's unlike a research proposal, which is forward-looking, where you're like, this is what I'm going to do. This is kind of a little backward-looking. This is like, tell me about the things you've done in the past. Give me concrete evidence. So you want to say why you want to do research. You want to say what do you want to do research on and why, but very broadly here, right? Like, I want to do hierarchical reinforcement learning because I think that's the way we solve general AI for these reasons. Okay. But that's one paragraph among the 2 pages. And then why you would be a good researcher and provide evidence. And the key thing here is to show, don't tell. Don't say, I'm a creative person. Say, I really enjoyed this one project that I was doing where we got stuck for this reason, and I couldn't think of a way around it. And then I spent like a week or two racking my brains, and one day I was in the shower, and I thought, aha, what happens if I do this cool thing? And then we got around the problem and we solved it. Okay, that is a concrete example of a thing that you can say in a statement of purpose that makes me believe that you're creative or that you're stubborn. So you want these concrete, specific, detailed evidence of all this stuff. So the structure that I give my undergraduate students when they want to write statement of purpose looks like this. First paragraph, introduction. Hi, my name is whatever, and I want to study computer science. It's like a double A meeting. Okay. The area you want to study, I want to do hierarchical reinforcement learning because I think it's key to general AI, and I'm really excited to consider to apply to your program for these reasons. And then paragraphs 2 to paragraph n-1 here is explicit data or explicit concrete examples of me doing things that illustrate that I could be a good researcher. So these are sorts of keywords that I like to think about. Good researchers are creative, they're stubborn. Stubborn should be number 1, actually. Stubborn is the number 1 attribute of a successful researcher. Technically deep, mathematically sophisticated, good judgment. Good judgment means you know when not to go down a rabbit hole. You know when to stop and decide that maybe this direction's not working and you change it. Thoughtful, like you didn't just write the code someone told you to write. You thought about why it was important or what it meant to do. And you're able to have new ideas. So this is a big thing I look out for. Has the student had an idea, had a technical idea once that was new or interesting in some way? And then can you carry that through from a conceptualization to the design, refinement, experiment writing result? That's a very rare skill. Okay, you're walking around one day, a bolt of lightning hits you, and you're like, wow, I should really think about applying X to Y. Now you've got to go and decide, okay, what does that mean exactly? It's conceptualization, right? How exactly do I decide to write that down? How am I going to do experiments or design proofs that actually show what I meant? How am I going to refine these things? How am I going to actually carry out the experiments? Can I write the code? Can I get the graphs? Can I write the thing down? Now, almost no students have all this, okay? But whatever of this you have, you should illustrate to me. Tell me about your history of doing things. Why do you think you're a researcher? Give me concrete details of the stuff that you've done. Give me real facts that I can believe your story. And then the final paragraph, you swap out for each school. And you say, I want to join Brown because, and then you give professors' names. You highlight them in bold, okay, because then the search committee is going to ask that professor to look at your application. And you give 1 or 2 sentences that show that you've read their work. So many applications that are going great until here fail because the 1 or 2 sentences indicate that you have not read my work or that you do not understand what my lab does. So don't look at the most recent publication. Look at the whole direction of the lab. I don't remember what my most recent publication was. It was probably an undergrad project that went to that it's not a thing I think about normally. So the best thing to do is to look at the whole direction of the publications or to see if the professor has given seminars anywhere. Okay, if they've given a seminar and they get to choose what they talk about, then they will talk about the thing that they care about, and that's what the lab does as a whole. So you should mention that in there. Okay, tips, final tips for US PhD applications. Don't pay. They're going to ask you to pay. It's $75 for each PhD application. There is a thing called a hardship waiver, right? And which is meant so the whole thing is kind of calibrated to American applicants. $75 is not a crazy amount of money in America. It's like the price for a nice dinner for 2 people. But they're not thinking hard about the exchange rate. Okay, so they have something called a hardship waiver. If you email them and you say, I'm sorry, $75 in my local currency is like a month's salary or some crazy thing like that, then they will send you a code and say, yeah, don't worry about that, just put this code in. Okay, so last year, and I think this will continue, Brown Computer Science agreed to waive any application fee for anyone coming from Africa because it's nuts to ask people for this sort of money. Okay. But you've got to ask. You've got to email them and say, I want to apply to your university. This is crazy, please give me a waiver, and they'll do it. This allows you to apply widely. I applied to 9 PhD locations when I was a grad student, and I got into 2. Okay, that's because there's a lot of variance that you don't see about how many other people there are in the pool, how many people are being hired this year, what areas the professor may have open. There's a lot of stuff. Focus on the advisor match. Watch the talks, don't use the last paper. Focus on demonstrating research potential. Do use your statement of purpose and your letters to situate your university if you think there's a good probability that the committee doesn't know much about it. Okay, so I got my letter writers to say University of the Witwatersrand is the undisputed best university in South Africa by miles, right? No, this is there may be a few people who disagree slightly, but they can only disagree slightly. But the point is that, that this was stated quite confidently in the letters, right? So they understood, even though if they've never heard of it before, they know how to think about you a little bit. Okay. So you're the slide after this, right, again, I think. Okay, good. Daniela's more organized than I am. Okay, so just quickly, what's the process of a PhD application? Now, that means like right after this, over beers or something, you should start thinking about your topic, and then you should start Googling frantically to identify professors at schools where you think you could do a PhD. Okay, so one way to do this, there are lots of lists ranking the best US graduate schools. So the one I used when I was a grad student was called the US News and World Report, and it ranks grad schools in AI and it ranks them in computer science. Look at everyone above like the top 30 or 40, and look at all the people in those schools and see if they do things that you think are interesting and relevant. Then in September, October, you have a short list of schools and professors, and then you ask people to write letters for you. Ask them well in advance. Okay, so you want to approach them early, you want to give them all the documentation you can, you want to help them write a good letter. Bear in mind that professors have bad short and long-term memory and attention spans, so you all know that by now, and they're disorganized. So that means you have to be organized and you have to function as their short and long-term memories. You have to send them an email saying, just a quick reminder, this deadline's coming up in 5 days. Okay. And then you want to take your tests, take them as early as you can. If you have to retake them, it's not a big deal, it just costs money. Okay. And then in December and January is where the various deadlines are. I kept a spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet allowed me to be reasonably organized. Iterate on this thing, it matters. Okay, because that's like where you might go and spend 5 years for a PhD, and that could dictate the course of the rest of your life. So don't write it quickly and then submit it. Spend a lot of time, ask people that you trust, and leave buffer for unexpected timings. There will be many, I promise. Okay, back to Daniela.
Thank you. Okay, so it says here fellowships, but more generally funding. So funding is obviously a big issue. PhD programs are not cheap. Living abroad, for example, is also not cheap. And this is, 4 to 5 years we're talking about. So I was lucky enough to be funded, but I submitted, I think it was 4 or 5 applications for funding, and only one of them was successful. So, you have to be resilient. So here are some of the scholarship programs which are available. We can share these slides afterwards, so don't worry about taking down all these notes. But there are many. Basically, there are websites dedicated to listing based on where you're from and what categories you may fall under or identify with. There are scholarships for many different categories. And so it's just a matter of doing a very deep dive to find them. And again, just keeping in mind, so a couple of important things. Timelines. So for example, one of the scholarships that I applied for to begin the next September, the deadline was end of August the year before. So it's really quite a long lead time. Motivate. So basically, as George said, a lot of these fellowship or scholarship applications require some kind of statement of purpose or research proposal to basically say, well, what am I going to do in this PhD program? So motivate why you want to do this research. Remember your audience. So in many cases, the committees that evaluate these applications are non-technical, which is quite different to your prospective supervisor or the academic committee at the university you're applying for. So remember not to make it too technical. They're not going to understand terms, like convolutional neural networks, or if you do use that term, explain what exactly it does. Be resilient, I said. You may have to apply multiple times. And then funding leads to win. So this, as George already mentioned, in UK institutions, for example, or European institutions, if you basically bring your own funding, then it's almost a formality to go through the application procedure via the university, but that is not the case for US institutions, where essentially you have to first convince the professor that you're worth taking on as a PhD student, and then the university will often come through with the funding. and obviously also partial funding, and that can also be an option. You can use this to supplement tuition fees or living costs while doing your PhD. Yep, I think in any case, if anyone came in late, basically this is just a reminder that we have a Google form where if you're currently applying for a PhD position and you want to potentially be paired up with a mentor to help you through this program, through this process, just enter your details on this Google form. So this has been a lot of us projecting information at you. So in the next 5 to 10 minutes, we're going to do some creativity exercises. So basically, on Thursday, there'll be a follow-up to the session, and that's going to be a session, an interactive practical session where you can sit there, write your own research proposals, discuss. There's going to be researchers and professors and postdocs available for you to discuss your drafts with. And so we thought that we can use some time today to just kind of get you thinking, well, what should you be thinking about when you're writing these proposals? What drives you? What is going to be, I mean, maybe you already know that hierarchical reinforcement learning to solve AGI is the thing that you want to do. But in many cases, perhaps you're an undergrad, you've done some courses in computer vision and you kind of found that interesting, and you've done some NLP, and that's kind of cool too, but you're not quite sure what exactly is going to be the topic that's going to drive you. So hopefully this will be a bit useful. So as an icebreaker, I guess everyone's a bit scattered out, so maybe the people sitting at the back can move forwards. But turn to your neighbor, tell them your name, where you're from, your dream job, and one random fact about yourself. So for example, my random fact is that I have a sparkly pineapple t-shirt, which I absolutely love, but I never wear it because I think it's unprofessional. All right, so if you guys want to just get into small groups and do some chatting. Hello? Hopefully that was a good opportunity for you to get to know your neighbors a little bit better.
So you're supposed to write the actual research proposal on Thursday, not now. Now you're just supposed to talk about it a bit and then stop.
Hello. Hello. Come back. Good stuff. All right, so hopefully
this is how you know you're a researcher, by the way. It's when you can't stop talking about your research. Anyway, sorry, Karen.
All right, so hopefully now you know your neighbors a little bit better. And so, yeah, we've taken this like really airy-fairy Venn diagram, basically as a route to try and get you to think about, well, what is it that you're really passionate about? What is the thing that is going to be the core of your proposal? And so there are 3 parts to this. Thinking about, okay, what am I passionate about? What drives me? What makes me get up in the morning and really just love what I do? The second thing is, okay, what am I good at? What is an example of something that I know I have just nailed? I'm just super good at this task or this skill. And then finally, the third thing, well, what does the world need? I think we're all here at the Indaba. It means that we all care about community, we all care about development, we all care about Africa. And so what does the world need? And basically piecing these 3 things together at that very sweet spot is the purpose, is your purpose. And so we've got a couple of minutes coming up now where I'd like us all to think, or you all to think, discuss in your groups or even just by yourself, what each of these things means to you. So we have a couple of leading questions. So I'll kind of, we'll do maybe like 1 minute on each. So in the first thing, what am I passionate about? Okay, what am I grateful for? What is important to me? And what makes me come alive? Now, again, this sounds very, very airy-fairy, but contextualize it in the case of in your research. So think about the things in what you've done. I mean, maybe think broadly and then try and narrow it down. Think about what broadly makes you passionate, what are you passionate about, and then narrow it down to even things that you've encountered at the Indaba, sessions that you've attended. What is something you really think is cool, and something that would make you come alive? So yeah, let's do one or 2 minutes on this. Okay, well, what am I good at? What work? And here, think about examples, concrete examples of what you've done that has impressed or helped others greatly. So something that you just know that you've gone out there and just knocked the ball out of the ballpark. Maybe just a tiny bit of what you could put in your research proposal. So here, what could I do professionally that would light me up inside and bring a positive contribution to my community and the world? So I think we'll leave this as a homework exercise, something to think about before Thursday's session. But yeah, taking what you've discussed, taking what you've been thinking about, maybe you haven't shared it exactly with your neighbor, but thinking about how these things all fit together and finding that sweet spot. And just some other pointers in thinking about this. Well, what would I do? And these things here are really important in formulating that research proposal. What would I do if this were unreasonable? What's holding me back? What needs to change? What are some steps I could take to get started? And all these answers to these questions could be useful in the research proposal itself. So yeah, as I said, on Thursday we have the interactive or practical session. So I guess we've already kind of discussed this. George has spoken a lot about what a statement of purpose looks like. At the start I spoke about what a research proposal looks like. Very similar, in fact, with the exception that it is forward-looking. So this is the research you will do. So I'm going to just talk briefly through this, but basically this is what hopefully will help you structure your research proposals. Hopefully maybe if you have already an existing draft, you can bring it up before Thursday and kind of see how you can shuffle it around to sort of get into this structure, and then Thursday's session will be nice and interactive where you can take these drafts and discuss them a little more deeply with some experts. So starting off at the beginning, an introduction or a motivation. This is basically saying, well, why should we care about the problem? Who is it affecting? What approaches have been done before? And what's wrong with them? What's missing? So this is answering the question why. Why should your research even begin? Then your research idea. This is answering the question what. What is your approach and why is it better? And then finally, your plan. So this is concrete steps or first steps of what would be needed, what would be part of the things that you would do as part of your PhD to tackle this research idea that you've had. So for example, collecting data, what experiments, basic set of experiments would you run, what resources do you need, some anticipated obstacles. So hopefully some of those questions before will help you in thinking about this. And yeah, this is answering the question how. So yeah, just some important characteristics which I think are useful and maybe used to judge the proposal. The originality of the idea, its feasibility. So if you've proposed something really cool, but it is like something that should form part of a 10-year grant rather than your 3 to 4 year PhD, it might reflect that you haven't really considered the problem properly, and the supervisor may be thinking, okay, well, maybe they're not realistic in what can be done. Ensuring that you've touched on the relevant literature. So this is really important. Essentially, I think it's quite closely linked to the originality of the idea. So if you have not included any ground, and in fact, this is a useful point, in the research proposal itself, citations and providing a couple of citations to ground your work in the literature is okay, is totally acceptable. And essentially, showing this connection to the relevant literature shows that you know what the current state of the art is, and you're aware of where things are currently, you're aware of what the limitations of the current models or the current problem is, and this is your approach to solve it. So I think relevant literature and originality of the idea are quite closely linked. Grammar and clarity. So this is quite an important one. So I found in things that I've reviewed, I don't judge against bad grammar when it doesn't affect my ability to comprehend what that person has said. So if I cannot understand because of the language barrier, then this affects me. This does then go on to influence how I view that. But if I can understand what the person is saying, and it is just a matter of I can see a language issue, then I am okay to look over it. But my recommendation is always get somebody who's first language English speaker to read over it for you. I mean, I'm more than happy to do this for people, and many people are. Many first language English speakers wouldn't mind reading a 1 or 2 page summary of what you've done and helping you providing you with some inputs. And then finally, which I think brings a lot of this all together, shows that the student has thought deeply about the subject, and importantly, that they are passionate about the problem, that they have the drive to take them through the next 3 to 4 years of research. So yeah, we've had, as George said, Lara and I did some polling of researchers, of faculty. So George will now take us through some of which I think are useful before we'll wrap up, some of the feedback that we got from these people, which I think will be useful when framing your research problem.
All right. So 75% of people say that they will reject your application if it's too general. Okay, so what that means is I would like to do AI because it would be cool to have intelligent robots. That's kind of all you've got. Okay, so you should at least identify a sub-area. Like I'm interested in machine learning and specifically reinforcement learning. Okay, if you're unrelated to the professor's interest, then it's very hard to get accepted. Right. So this is a bit weaker in the UK. I think some of the UK professors will communicate with you and say, I see that you want to do X, but I do Y. In the US, it's just an instant reject. Okay. You have to fit very, very carefully. Too ambitious sometimes means that you don't have an understanding of what is feasible in the time frame that you're talking about. Too long, so I generally tell people to stick to 2 pages. Okay. So I spend like, I think Brown gets a couple of 100 PhD applications. I usually have to read about 75 in the course of a couple of days. So it's not that someone is going to read this in depth. It's not a novel or anything like that. You just want to get the main points across and be as clear as you can. One thing to say that I think is a bit, maybe a bit stronger than, for me personally, than what Daniela said is, I will definitely reject you if you submit something with bad grammar. Okay? And that sounds obnoxious, but what it means is that you didn't ask enough people to look at this thing for you. I reject lots of first language native English speakers for bad grammar. Okay, so even if you are a first language native English speaker, find a friend who will read this thing, because by the 10th write through of it, you're bored and your eyes are skipping over the obvious mistakes. And I find that I spend a very large fraction of my time teaching my students to write technically, and it's even harder if I first have to get them to be able to write, fully correctly and then be able to write clearly technically. No sign of having read the relevant papers from the lab field, obviously really bad. Deal breakers, quality of writing is too poor, research topics unrelated, proposals not connected, lack of technical specifics. Don't go too specific here. You don't have to say I'm going to prove this theorem, but you should be willing to say, yeah, I want to approach this problem with broadly this family of techniques. So Lara and Daniela polled against some professors and said, what do you like to see in such a thing? So clarity, one clear idea, personal and related to their own background. Includes the state of the art, critical thinking, so identifying the strengths and weaknesses of what currently works and what doesn't work. So one hint, for example, is in reinforcement learning, you look at the x-axis of a learning graph. If it's got more than 10 millions in it, then there's a weakness. Okay, more than 10 million samples is bad. Feasible research directions are good to see. Match with the research interest is totally mandatory. Decent proposals have a well-defined goal, plus how solving the goal will be important. Understand how the state of the art relates to that goal, identifies how it falls short, and there's evidence of creative flair in that there's a nub of an original idea. You don't have to have the whole thing fully formed, but you've got to have like a bit of a feeling. This one I really like. I've done this before. I've accepted students for this reason. I distinctly recall an application that showed that the student was thinking about exactly the questions that drove me to study my field. I could see that it was what they were looking for. In the first semester they took my course, and since then they've been fascinated by the topic and motivated by their own curiosity. Sometimes people have preliminary results. I think that that's extremely unusual, but it's possible. Perhaps if you did a master's in the same field. Okay. Things professors didn't like: too general, too high level, poorly written, spelling and grammar. Poor proposals tend to be overambitious, poorly structured, too general, demonstrate lack of understanding of the existing literature. And then there's this buzzword thing happening. So I get lots of applications going like, AI is going to change the world, and then the singularity pops up somewhere, and then there's like superhuman intelligence, and so it's not a New York Times article. You're talking to someone who's a professional in the field. You have to be a professional in the field. It's okay to be excitable. I'm excitable because I think we can solve that general AI problem, but you also have to be a little down to earth and not too buzzwordy. If there are buzzwords scattered throughout, then that makes me nervous. Makes me think you've just decided to do this after reading, something in the Huffington Post about how cool AI is, and that's how hard you've thought about it. Okay. Additional tips. Actually, this is just like a life tip. You should read all the papers you can read, right? Especially in the beginning. Actually, one thing that I would recommend, I did this before I applied for PhDs, find like 1 or 2 PhD theses and just have a look at them. You don't have to read them in great detail, but if they're coming from like a lab you care about, just to see what the thing feels like how big it is, and what kind of results you have. Okay. Starting primarily from a point of curiosity is important. PhD is a multi-year commitment, and this seems trivial to you now because most of you all are in your 20s. But as you approach your 30s, this multi-year part starts to get like more exponentially scary, right? I turned 30 in my PhD program, and I swore that I would not turn 30 in that little town. And so I drove to another town, and I booked a hotel room, and I stayed overnight in the other town, just so that I wouldn't turn 30 in the small town in which I was studying. So these things get to you a little bit in the end, right? So it's okay to be speculative, but at the same time, ground the speculation in reality. How do things work out today? What incremental steps can you take? The first paragraph should grab attention. If it's about the history of your learning, CS is a book. Oh no, man, this happens a lot. No. Never ever start with, when I was 6, I learned to program and therefore I'm great. Do not ever say that. No one cares what age you were when you learned to program. It's just got nothing to do with anything. So actually I found when I did this, the intro paragraph was the hardest thing to write. It's okay to start with, my name is George Konidaris and I'm writing to apply to your PhD program. It's not like, Dostoevsky or anything, but it's serviceable. Don't use buzzwords. Do not mention my papers by name unless you actually read them and have something to say that convinces me you actually read them. So this person is clearly British, because don't try to convince me that you're already a researcher. Convince me that you're motivated by curiosity about the right questions. You can discuss past work to show your passion and the questions you would like to answer, but it's mostly forward-looking. This is for a research proposal. In the American system, if you can show that you're already a researcher, you're golden. So for a statement of purpose, you want to focus on that if you can. For a research proposal, you kind of want to be forward-looking instead. Okay. Figuring out a good place is the number one thing. One thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is that you're not applying to a university or even a department. You're almost always applying to a lab. Okay, and so the lab is the thing that's going to dominate your experience. So find the lab that does the thing that you care about and focus on that. Make your idea concrete using examples, simple language rather than jargon. Okay. And be honest, yes. So I find this occasionally. Someone has clearly pasted the motivation section from one of my papers and kind of rewritten it. You'd be amazed at what comes through in these sorts of essays, right? Like what you really care about is usually pretty clear. Okay, so one thing before we end. So on Thursday there's this interactive research proposal session. One thing I'd like to say before we end is that I think Daniela and I both feel this way. We feel immensely lucky to be born at this moment in history when you don't have to be an aristocrat to do research. So like all the people that you've heard about from Laplace and stuff like that, they were all aristocrats. They were people who were independently wealthy and therefore they got to do research. And right now there's this immense opportunity before you, which is that by just being extremely smart, you can be in a position where someone will pay your living expenses and give you a reasonable salary just to think. Okay, and that's kind of amazing and super cool. And it's not the historical norm. So the opportunity before you is huge and fascinating and super cool, and you should take it. Okay, we'll see you on Thursday. Yeah.
Can you take some questions?
Are there questions?
Yeah, it's already just gone past 8, but I think we have time. If anyone has burning questions, we can take a couple, and then everyone can finally have...
Okay, I have a question. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My question actually is, one of the questions I've been asking myself for a while about, you said that when you want to take a student, or most professors want to take a student for PhD, they look at the transcript, and mostly the transcript usually contain coursework, like the course they have taken, but you want to judge someone from research, but you look at the coursework. Is it really appropriate to go and look that way? So that's kind of my question. And I hope also that we'll get the slide.
The slides are going to be public, right?
Yeah, the slides will be part of will be put on the Indaba website. Cool. Yep. You can take it.
So I can tell you that for me, so everything's idiosyncratic about this, right? Every professor decides, in many cases themselves, from the last set of students who they're going to take. I look at coursework because I want to know, like, you can do the math. So, because it doesn't matter how passionate you are, if you can't do the math, then I'm a bit nervous that you can finish, right? So I'm going to look for, and I care much less about the first couple of years of your degree than the last couple of years. Were you doing courses that seemed advanced? Were you doing all right in them? And this is more a sanity check. So it will never get you in, no matter how high your grades are, but it can create doubt where I'm like, oh, I'm not sure if this person can handle the math, or it's going to take too long to teach them. That's why we look at the transcripts in most cases. Does that make sense?
Let's take 2 more questions.
All right. Thanks so much for the exposition on PhD applications and the requirement. But then you made a very profound statement. We join labs. We should rather focus on labs or research groups instead of universities, which is very good. But I have a question. Which lab do you or must you normally join? Should we consider the well-established, famous researcher, or we should consider the early career scientists? How do we balance that? There are pros and cons for each, but what's your perspective on it? Thanks.
Yeah, so good question. So, okay, so the first part of the question is, well, how do I find a research lab? In the current day and age, Twitter is very alive and well. Lots of labs have websites that are they're up to date, so just search the web, look at what the lab is doing, see what recent publications they have, as you said, all of the sort of body of work that the lab is doing. So yeah, the web is your best friend when you're trying to find a research lab that matches what you're interested in. And then the second part of your question, well, how do you know what is a good lab to choose? So yeah, in my case, my PhD supervisor is a very established researcher. So we had a lab of around 30 to 35 people, which is a pretty big lab. And obviously at that level, my supervisor couldn't give me exact specific technical feedback as regularly as if the lab were smaller. So that's not to say that's a bad thing. Because he's an established researcher, it meant that he was able to send me to conferences, he was able to connect me with people that he knew, other collaborators very easily, which may not have been possible if the lab was smaller or if the supervisor was lesser known. But at the same time, that's not to discount a lab that's just starting. PhD supervisors who are just starting their lab are incredibly passionate about their students. They care a lot, they're growing their lab, they invest a lot in their students. So I think what it comes down to is just identifying in yourself, well, what kind of researcher are you? Do you work well being quite hands-on managed, or do you kind of like to just keep a light touch with your supervisor and kind of go off in your own? Or are you the kind of person who likes to go off in your own research direction and only touch base with your supervisor every now and again? So I think it's a bit of a personal preference.
Hello.
Where are you?
Okay. I'm here, right here. I just want to ask about the English proficiency. Is there any way to go around it, or is there any alternatives?
So in my case, I grew up in South Africa, so I did all my schooling and my tertiary education in English. So I found it quite strange that the universities were then requiring that I do this English language course. And so I emailed the course conveners to the universities that I applied for, saying, here's evidence of all of the degrees that I've done in English. Can you waive this? And they did waive it, so I didn't end up having to do the language course. So I think just an email to the course convener showing that you have a background in tertiary education in English would maybe be a way that they can waive that.
Okay.
I would say even if you don't have, you didn't study in English language school, then you have to take the TOEFL exam. But it is a drillable thing. It's not like you're going to walk in there and they're going to ask you to write a novel. It's like any other test. You can practice it, get to know how, get to figure out how well it works, and just become good enough at it. The standards for getting a high enough TOEFL score to not be automatically rejected are not that high, and then they don't look at it again. So you just practice it a few times, hit it, and then get some nice score, and then don't think about it again.
All right, one last question, because I think the mic is still there. Okay.
I have 2 questions. One is actually a clarification. While you were starting, you said something about something new PhD producing something new, then versus something better. So I really want to clarify, is a PhD producing an invention? Is it getting an invention or getting something better? I just need a clarification clearly on that.
Okay, so the way to think about it is it's an advance in the knowledge of the world. You have contributed to the world's knowledge by adding a new thing. Now that new thing could be like an invention, like here's a new device. Or it could be like here's a new algorithm. There were 5 and here's a 6th one that solves the same problem but it's slightly better. Or it could be here's a new problem we haven't been thinking about. We should think about it. Here's some data and some first results. So what you find in practice, it's measured by scientific publications, right? So if you want to think about a hard and fast definition, it's some number of acceptable scientific papers. But I like to think about it as, as you added something to the world's knowledge. That makes sense.
Okay. So the last one is you will be talking about applying to a lab. I don't know the reality in other African countries, but the reality in my own country is that there are no labs. I don't know for others. So if I don't know how to apply to a lab that doesn't exist, then you also talked about selecting a professor. I also don't know the realities in other African countries. In my own country, you apply for a PhD and you are assigned a professor. A supervisor is assigned to you. And you are just stuck with that person, whether you are... So how do you handle that in our own context? Thank you.
Okay, so when I say lab, I really meant professor. If you're getting assigned randomly to a professor, that's not so great. I would be wary of that. I would say, though, that if you applied and you identified specific professors in your application, I would doubt that the assignment is completely random. I think it's likely if you say, I want to come here to work on this topic with this person, it's most likely that you will get assigned to that person. I would not enter a PhD program where I'm assigned to a random professor that I know nothing about, because you don't, what's your PhD going to be about? You don't know. I would be very wary of that.
All right. Should we wrap up there?
Can we have one final question?
Okay, one final question.
Okay. In the recommendation letter, what are the important points my recommender teacher or manager should focus on?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
In the recommendation letter, what are the main and the important points my manager or teacher should focus on, mentioning it in the recommendation letter?
Yeah, I think we had them in the slides.
We had them in the slides, yeah, but very briefly, the main thing is they should sort of tell the story of the stuff that you've done for them that made them feel like you would be a good researcher in concrete, explicit detail, like this person did this and they were very creative here and they were very stubborn there. And they should inform all the things that aren't in the transcript or the CV, like this is a good school and this person is the best student we've seen in 10 years. That's not a thing that's in your CV, right? But it's something that your professor could say about you. Or this person wrote this research program that was so cool and they did it almost on their own and they only came to me for high-level stuff and they were very creative, like that sort of stuff. So when I write a recommendation letter, I start saying, I've known the student for this long in this capacity. And then I talk a little bit about their peers. This student is the best student in 5 years, or this student is a student who's coming from this university, which is very good. And then I tell the story of how we work together, and I highlight the parts that I think indicate they would be a good researcher. And then at the end, I give an explicit recommendation. You should accept this person into your program. Yeah. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. All right.
All right. Good night, everyone, and we'll
Thank
see you
you.
tomorrow.